The transmission began without warning, every channel across Earth overridden by the same cold signal. At first people thought it was another propaganda stunt, until the images sharpened and the scale of what was unfolding became undeniable. A galactic audience was forced to watch as 10 billion human lives were extinguished, not in shadow, not in secrecy, but broadcasted like an execution designed to break the will of an entire species. Cities glowed and then crumbled, orbital platforms ruptured into molten debris, and refugee convoys were annihilated in carefully staged spectacles. The Empire wanted the galaxy to witness, and they ensured every frame carried their message. Humans were nothing but an example, and defiance meant obliteration. Everywhere, reactions erupted with a force words could not contain. Families screamed as they recognized faces on the broadcast, leaders trembled in shock, soldiers clenched their fists, and billions sat in silence staring at screens that showed their kind being erased like insects under a cruel hand. The Empire's narrators mocked the victims as they died, speaking in tones of superiority, repeating that this was merely a lesson. They claimed that mercy had already been extended, that humanity's refusal to bend left no choice but demonstration. Their language was polished, detached, designed to strip away the humanity of those being killed. Yet the very act of dehumanization only deepened the wound, for every viewer felt the truth behind the Empire's words. This was not punishment, it was contempt. In moments, sorrow turned to something darker. Governments convened emergency sessions but struggled to find words. The United Earth Council could issue no comfort, because nothing could blunt the fact that a vast portion of humanity was gone forever. What grew instead was fury, a collective rage so profound it united the fractured world in a way no treaty or promise had ever achieved. People who hours before argued over politics or culture now shared the same raw vow: this could not stand. Anger spread like a second broadcast, whispered in homes, shouted in streets, etched into the eyes of those who had lost everyone. The wound was universal. No border or class remained untouched. The Empire's arrogance extended further. They closed the transmission with a declaration that 10 billion lives were but a warning shot. The coldness of the words resonated longer than the images themselves. They spoke of obedience, demanded compliance, and left the suggestion that worse could follow if humanity resisted again. For them it was theater, a brutal performance meant to instill fear across not only Earth but all watching civilizations. To many other species it worked. But for humans, whose history was woven with scars of defiance, the effect was not paralysis but ignition. In the hours that followed, the world entered a silence unlike any in recorded memory. Entire cities mourned at once, candles lit in windows, crowds gathered in squares, eyes staring upward as if the night sky itself might offer answers. Military officers replayed the transmission in bunkers, noting every tactic, every arrogant phrase. Scientists studied the broadcast, not to despair but to glean weaknesses from the enemy's display. Even in grief, the human mind sought patterns, openings, possibilities for retribution. What had been meant as psychological destruction became the seed of future resolve. Parents held their surviving children tighter, whispering promises that no more would be taken without price. Veterans spoke of humanity's long tradition of resistance, from ancient wars to modern conflicts, reminding listeners that humanity had never been allowed to survive easily, and yet survival had always been achieved. Across networks now controlled by Earth, commentators repeated one phrase with grim determination: 10 billion will not be forgotten. That repetition became a mantra, echoing in broadcasts, in speeches, in the private vows of soldiers preparing for what they already sensed must come. The Empire believed the lesson would be submission. They had miscalculated. The horror, the grief, and the unbearable spectacle had not broken humanity. It had concentrated their spirit, forging from agony something sharper than before. 10 billion lives had been stolen in a moment, but in their loss humanity discovered the one truth the Empire never understood: when pushed to the edge of existence, humans do not surrender, they transform. In that transformation lay the beginning of a retaliation no empire could ever imagine. The silence that followed the massacre did not last. Within hidden chambers deep beneath fortified cities, leaders from every nation convened with military commanders, scientists, and advisors. No one arrived with optimism, but none could allow despair to dominate. The transmission of slaughter had given them no illusions. There was no possibility of negotiation. The Empire had marked humanity as a species to be subjugated or erased. What remained was the question of how to respond, and whether survival meant bowing to tyranny or embracing vengeance no matter the cost. The gathering began fractured. Some argued for capitulation, insisting that preserving the remnants of the human race was worth any humiliation. They pointed out the imbalance of power, the scale of the fleets that had destroyed 10 billion lives with almost casual precision. Others rejected that thinking outright, their voices burning with fury. They reminded the chamber that surrender was an illusion, that submission would only prolong suffering, not prevent it. Humanity's survival could not be secured through compliance, because the Empire had already shown contempt too deep to be reversed. The argument circled with intensity, yet every voice was bound by the same memory of what had been broadcast. No one could forget the screams, the annihilated cities, the sneering commentary of the executioners. When the debate threatened to spiral into paralysis, a single choice reframed the discussion. A projection played across the chamber, recordings from the broadcast spliced with faces of those who had perished. Infants pulled from wreckage, families begging as soldiers laughed, entire populations turned to ash. The silence afterward was absolute. No more words in favor of surrender were spoken. It was no longer about strategy or politics. It was about honor, vengeance, and justice. A plan began to take form, whispered first in fragments, then spoken aloud with a conviction that grew stronger with every voice added. Humanity would not settle for defense or survival. Humanity would strike back with intent so absolute that the Empire itself would cease to exist. The name given to this decision carried no ambiguity: Operation Alien Extinct. Its goal was not negotiation, deterrence, or even conventional victory. It was retribution on a scale that would erase the architects of the massacre, root and branch, and ensure the galaxy understood the consequence of provoking Earth. The Council mapped out what such an operation would demand. Resources had to be mobilized beyond anything attempted in human history. Technology once locked away for fear of ethical consequence would need to be unleashed. Every surviving industrial complex, every scientific laboratory, every military academy had to contribute. Soldiers would be trained not as defenders but as avengers, knowing they might not return. The line between civilian and combatant blurred as volunteers from every walk of life declared their willingness to fight. Humanity, fractured for so long by internal disputes, found unity in tragedy. That unity solidified into an unspoken oath: the dead would be avenged, and no cost would be too high. Emotions ran deeper than strategy. Parents stood before the council and offered their surviving children for service, saying they would rather see them die fighting than watch them live under chains. Scientists, long bound by codes of restraint, announced they were prepared to design weapons without moral limit. Generals, their faces lined with grief, swore that the war would not end until the Empire's worlds burned as Earth's had burned. The chamber resonated with a singular spirit. Humanity had been given no choice but to become what the Empire feared most. The decision was finalized without a single dissenting vote. Every representative signed the order to begin. Operation Alien Extinct was no longer a proposal but the destiny of a wounded species. Messages were transmitted to every hidden base and surviving colony, carrying instructions cloaked in secrecy. Prepare for the war that would define the future of mankind. No broadcasts announced this choice to the galaxy. No speeches were given to comfort the people. Instead, the silence of the council broke into action, the machinery of vengeance beginning to turn. The Empire had intended to kill the human will with their spectacle. Instead, they had created a storm that no power could contain. Humanity, forged by loss and sharpened by rage, had decided that if extinction was on the table, it would not be their own. The galaxy would soon discover the terrible truth that when humans are pushed beyond the edge, they do not merely fight for survival. They fight to ensure their enemies never rise again. Factories that once forged tools of progress were stripped down overnight and remade into engines of war. The hum of production no longer spoke of civilian life but of retribution. Every surviving industrial hub, from the underground shipyards beneath shattered cities to orbital stations cloaked from Imperial scans, was redirected toward a single purpose. Assembly lines moved without pause, workers refusing rest as machines poured out components for weapons humanity had never before dared to build. Scientists who once competed for grants and prestige now worked side by side, bound not by rivalry but by vengeance. The boundaries of discipline collapsed. Engineers merged physics with biology, programmers blended warfare with artificial intelligence, and forbidden theories long locked in archives were resurrected with grim determination. Innovations surged under desperation. Antimatter warheads were stabilized through reckless ingenuity, their containment fields held together by designs deemed too dangerous for peacetime. Nanite swarms, originally conceived for medical purposes, were reprogrammed into self-replicating clouds that could strip starships bare molecule by molecule. Cloaking technology, stolen piecemeal from forgotten Imperial wreckage, was adapted into stealth systems beyond anything the galaxy had yet witnessed. Humanity's strength had never been in refinement, it had always been in adaptation, in turning scraps into weapons and limitations into advantages. The Empire's arsenal might have been superior on paper, but Earth's laboratories now produced horrors that disregarded the rules the galaxy held sacred. Training grounds filled with volunteers who required no conscription. Young and old, men and women, the broken and the furious, all demanded to be armed. Entire generations, scarred by the broadcast of genocide, stepped forward with eyes that no longer held fear. The drills were merciless. Instructors pushed recruits until bodies collapsed, and even then the fallen rose again, unwilling to be left behind. Simulations of zero-gravity combat ran continuously, forging reflexes suited for shipboarding missions and sabotage operations. Veterans who had fought in lesser wars drilled squads with brutal honesty. Hesitation would mean death, and death would mean failure to avenge the billions already lost. Behind the soldiers stood the engineers of destruction. Massive carriers were built not as symbols of might but as platforms of annihilation, each vessel equipped to function autonomously should its crew fall. Automated factories were hidden within their holds, allowing them to resupply deep in enemy space. Smaller craft were designed for infiltration, able to slip past detection nets and tear apart infrastructure from within. Earth's fleet, once laughably small compared to Imperial armadas, was reshaped into a force defined not by numbers but by unpredictability and ruthlessness. The willingness to abandon restraint marked the greatest shift. Human leaders authorized research once forbidden under every ethical code. Bioweapons engineered to adapt faster than any countermeasure, electronic viruses that spread through ship networks like wildfire, gravitational disruptors capable of tearing stations apart, each was developed with a simple guiding principle. If it terrified the Council's own members, it was worth completing. Humanity did not seek balance or fair engagement. They sought decisive, overwhelming retaliation. As preparations intensified, secrecy became paramount. False transmissions misled Imperial intelligence into believing humanity was still paralyzed by grief. Decoys disguised as refugee fleets were launched into space, luring scouts into traps that never reported back. Entire communication networks were rebuilt behind layers of encryption so advanced even Earth's own operators sometimes struggled to access them. The shadows became humanity's shield, and within those shadows a storm grew that the Empire had no notion of until too late. The scale of unity was unprecedented. Nations that had once fought over borders and resources contributed without hesitation. Wealthy families poured fortunes into construction, not for recognition but for revenge. Farmers donated fuel supplies, miners worked themselves to collapse in order to deliver raw materials, and students abandoned classrooms to take positions in research labs or training camps. Every segment of humanity's fractured identity fused into a singular blade. When the final review of readiness was called, there was no celebration. The faces that gathered new joy had no place in what was coming. What bound them was not glory but resolve. Humanity had transformed grief into weaponry, rage into machinery, and despair into unity. Operation Alien Extinct was no longer just a plan etched into military files. It had become the heartbeat of a wounded species. The moment the order was given, the galaxy would witness not the broken remnants of a conquered race, but a force willing to rewrite the balance of power with blood and fire. The first strikes came without warning, silent as the void. Entire Imperial patrol fleets disappeared in moments, their transmissions cut mid-sentence, leaving only static across their channels. Reports never reached command. Human operatives had infiltrated communication arrays, releasing viruses that spread faster than fire through dry grass, crippling navigation systems and shutting down weapons mid-charge. In less than an hour, entire sectors went dark, their silence more terrifying than open battle. The Empire had expected groveling, not precision. They had expected fear, not retribution delivered with surgical brutality. The offensive unfolded like a storm. Human carriers emerged from hyperspace cloaked in stolen and modified technology, releasing swarms of drones that split into smaller fragments, overwhelming defenses with numbers and unpredictability. Imperial admirals attempted to reorganize, but every maneuver met with sabotage. Fuel depots imploded under nanite infiltration. Shipyards once thought untouchable crumbled as gravity warheads tore their foundations apart. Civilian colonies loyal to the Empire watched in horror as skies lit with fire, their confidence in the invincible fleet shattered by a foe once dismissed as primitive. Human fleets moved with a tempo alien minds could not comprehend. The Empire relied on predictable hierarchies, chains of command that demanded coordination and approval. Humans thrived on improvisation. Captains made battlefield decisions without waiting for centralized orders, each strike group acting as both hammer and scalpel. Flexibility became their greatest weapon. Where the Empire sought to crush resistance through scale, humanity answered with unpredictability and relentless momentum. Every battle escalated the fear. Human code infiltrated targeting systems, turning Imperial weapons against their own ships. Crews were left to watch helplessly as their cannons swiveled inward, their engines overloaded, their shields dropped in synchronization with enemy barrages. Survivors spoke of shadows moving through corridors just before explosions ripped through hulls, whispers of human infiltration teams tearing ships apart from within. Terror spread faster than news could be censored. The message was undeniable: humanity was no longer prey. No mercy was shown. When Imperial broadcasts begged for civilians to be spared, they echoed the same pleas Earth's citizens had once voiced before being annihilated on camera. The answer humanity gave was silence, followed by fire. Cities loyal to the Empire were leveled in deliberate symmetry with the massacre humanity had endured. Entire populations burned, their screams transmitted back across Imperial channels just as humanity's had been. The Empire learned what it meant to be mirrored in cruelty, their lesson rewritten by those they thought broken. Other species watched with unease as reports spread. The galaxy had long whispered of humanity's resilience, but no one had imagined their vengeance would be this absolute. Diplomats attempted to mediate, but Earth ignored them. This was not politics. This was not conquest. This was the raw application of fury transformed into strategy. Operation Alien Extinct was not designed for negotiation or compromise. It was crafted to carve the Empire out of existence, root and branch. Imperial strongholds fell in rapid succession. Worlds once thought impenetrable cracked under barrages of experimental weaponry. Moons shattered under gravitational disruptors, stations twisted into wreckage fields that would orbit as monuments to arrogance. Entire legions vanished into traps sprung with unnerving precision. What had been meant to cow humanity had become the catalyst for the Empire's undoing, and no plea could halt the tide once it began. The strikes were relentless, not because of cruelty alone but because hesitation would mean betrayal of the 10 billion already gone. Humanity carried their memory as both weight and fuel, ensuring every attack resonated with the echo of lost voices. For every crater left behind, for every smoldering ruin, humanity's vow resounded louder: never again would their kind be slaughtered without consequence. The Empire had forced a broadcast of death across the galaxy. Now humanity forced a broadcast of their extinction. By the time the Empire realized the scale of collapse, their command structure had already dissolved. Leaders who had once spoken of dominance now cowered behind dwindling fleets, praying for a reprieve that never arrived. Earth's war machine advanced without pause, unstoppable because it was not driven by conquest but by a singular demand for justice. Where the Empire had once looked upon humanity as insects to be crushed, they now saw predators who had learned to hunt in silence. The galaxy bore witness as the unthinkable unfolded, an empire undone not by equals, but by those it had tried to erase. The Empire's throne world smoldered in silence, its proud spires reduced to jagged shards of molten stone. The fleets that once patrolled its skies had been turned into drifting wrecks, their hulls pitted with scars left by weapons designed only for destruction. No rescue signals pulsed from its surface, no authority remained to answer the desperate calls of survivors scattered across a collapsing dominion. For the first time in centuries, the galaxy stared at an absence of order not caused by politics or rebellion but by annihilation. Humanity had not merely won, they had erased. Across the stars, fragments of the Empire tried to gather themselves, but every attempt ended the same way. Human strike groups appeared in orbit, swift and merciless, reducing command hubs to silence before orders could be relayed. Governors who once boasted of loyalty were vaporized in their own palaces, their messages of surrender cut short. Colonies that had mocked Earth's weakness now lay buried in ash. The Empire's survivors understood that this was not war by conventional standards. It was eradication carried out with cold precision. Earth did not seek tribute or territory. Earth sought balance and blood. When the campaign reached its final stages, humanity turned outward with one unified voice. A transmission spread across galactic networks, not filled with threats or bargaining but with clarity. It reminded all who listened of the 10 billion lives extinguished in that broadcast. It repeated the arrogance of the Empire's declaration, then answered with the ruins now burning across its once mighty domain. The voice that carried the message spoke without emotion, stating simply that Earth had avenged its fallen, and would never again accept subjugation. It warned that if such atrocities were repeated, extinction would not hesitate to follow, no matter who stood responsible. The galaxy trembled at the certainty behind the words. Species who had long balanced under the Empire's shadow suddenly reevaluated their place. Some felt relief, seeing in humanity a force that had shattered the tyrant that had held them captive for generations. Others recoiled, terrified that a species capable of such vengeance might one day turn its wrath upon them. What none could deny was that Earth had stepped out of the margins of history and into the center, not by conquest but by demonstrating that survival alone was never their final goal. Back on Earth, there were no celebrations. Cities scarred by grief still carried the weight of mourning. Families rebuilt their homes, survivors searched for meaning, and leaders avoided triumphal speeches. Humanity did not revel in victory because the cost was etched into every face, every memory of those who had been lost. The war had given them justice, but it had not brought them joy. Instead, it left them with a lesson written in fire, that they were capable of both unimaginable suffering and unimaginable retaliation. The choice to become executioners had not been made lightly, yet once made, it had been carried out to the fullest measure. The galaxy recorded the aftermath as a warning carved into history. The Empire, once the unquestioned ruler of countless systems, was gone, its very name destined to dissolve into memory. In its place stood humanity, diminished in number yet towering in defiance. They were no longer regarded as fragile newcomers. They were remembered as the species that answered massacre with extinction. Whispers spread in every council chamber, in every distant colony. If humans could do this when broken, what would they be capable of if ever united by ambition rather than grief? Humanity itself understood the answer. They knew their power now, but they also knew the price. They returned to their rebuilding not as conquerors but as survivors tempered by vengeance. Yet beneath the quiet of reconstruction lay a truth none could deny. The next empire, the next predator, the next arrogant voice that tried to erase them would not be warned twice. Humanity had already shown the galaxy what it meant to provoke them. The 10 billion lost were not just victims. They were the spark of a fire that had consumed an empire and reshaped the future. The message that endured was stark and unforgettable. Humanity does not forgive extinction. they return it.